Okay, let's talk about something serious. It's incredibly striking when a sitting Supreme Court Justice, Ketanji Brown Jackson, comes out publicly and says the Trump administration's attacks on judges are, quote, not random and designed to intimidate. That part really jumps out. Designed to intimidate. That feels like more than just politics as usual. It feels like a major warning sign for our democracy. For a justice to use language like that, designed to intimidate, wow, it even carries legal undertones, hinting at potential obstruction or other abuses of power. It suggests this isn't just disagreement, it's something else, a grave threat to the independence of the judiciary. That's why I wanted to do this deep dive, not just catch up on headlines, but really unpack what Justice Jackson said and put it in the context of the administration's whole agenda. Think about the new Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE, they're calling it, and the relentless targeting of judges who don't rule their way. The mission here is to cut through the noise and figure out what this danger actually means for the foundations of how our government is supposed to work. Justice Jackson's comments aren't happening in a vacuum. They feel like confirmation of a pattern, perhaps a calculated strategy to chip away at judicial independence, that crucial check and balance in our system. Let's get into that strategy. Jackson sees the attacks on the judiciary clearly as deliberate, not just random outbursts. We've seen it happen when judges rule against controversial policies, like the attempt to use the old Alien Enemies Act for mass deportations. Remember the stories about planes being turned around mid-flight? The recklessness was astounding. So, judges push back based on the law, and then what happens? That's where Justice Jackson's point about intimidation comes in. The administration often doesn't just argue the law or appeal through normal channels. No, it escalates, gets personal. We see personal attacks, questioning a judge's patriotism, even threats. It's about undermining their legitimacy. The goal seems to be to make judges scared, to make them think twice before ruling against the White House. It creates a climate where fear, not law, influences decisions. Justice Jackson's quote nails it. The attacks are not random, they seem designed to intimidate. These threats and harassment are attacks on our democracy, on our system of government, ultimately risking undermining our Constitution and the rule of law. Coming from a Supreme Court justice, that's powerful. An independent judiciary depends on judges making calls based only on the law, without fearing retaliation. If the executive branch makes them afraid, the whole system is compromised. Now, let's look at this new department, DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency. Even the acronym has a certain ring to it, maybe not a good one. They say it's about streamlining things, making government more efficient, but is that really it? When you see it alongside these attacks on judges and other institutions, you start to wonder if it's more about consolidating power. Could it be a way to centralize control in the White House, bypass usual oversight, and push the agenda through with less scrutiny? It looks like another potential tool to weaken checks and balances, making it harder for anyone to push back. That's a real risk. If you centralize power too much, even under the banner of efficiency, the potential for overreach, for abuse, goes way up. This makes the courts, the ones already under attack, even more critical, assuming they can remain independent. Which brings us back to those intimidation tactics. This isn't abstract, it affects real people, judges, and their families. When the president publicly singles out a judge, calls them names, that sends a message. People listen, and unfortunately, there seems to be a correlation between that kind of rhetoric and judges facing harassment, maybe even real threats. It's not just politics at that point, it's about safety and security. Some call it stochastic terrorism. The rhetoric isn't a direct order, but it incites random acts from people motivated by it, aimed right at the courts. It's a disturbing concept, but it seems like an applicable framework here. If you constantly paint judges as enemies or traitors because you don't like their rulings, someone might eventually act on that. Someone might feel justified. Even Chief Justice Roberts, usually very reserved, felt he had to say something. Remember his statement about impeachment not being a tool just because you disagree with a judge's ruling? That seems significant, showing how serious the situation had become that the Chief Justice himself needed to defend that basic principle. But one rare statement from Roberts versus this constant, daily barrage from the administration feels unequal. Now you hear open calls for impeaching judges just for their legal rulings. Representative Jamie Raskin called it a constitutional crisis in motion, and he put his finger right on it. The idea of impeaching judges for doctrinal differences because their legal interpretation isn't the president's is a massive, dangerous departure from how our system is supposed to work. It fundamentally misunderstands or maybe ignores the whole point of independent courts. Trump's focus on Judge Boasberg feels personal because Boasberg ruled against using that Alien Enemies Act. Using that act itself is revealing it's an old law meant for declared wars, giving the executive huge power with very little judicial check. Trying to use it for deportations now shows a desire to bypass normal legal processes, the safeguards protecting people's rights. It seems to be about finding ways around judicial review, not about the law, but about raw power, like do what I say or else. Obedience over the Constitution seems to be the underlying message, a preference for unchecked executive authority where due process and the rule of law become mere obstacles. Then you have Stephen Miller's language. Wow, calling a ruling that requires due process a legal insurrection against national sovereignty? That kind of rhetoric is extreme. To call applying basic legal principles an insurrection is incredibly disrespectful to the courts and feels designed to inflame. It works to demonize judges, further eroding public trust. If people hear judges are leading an insurrection, why trust their decisions? It also feels like weaponized xenophobia, implying any legal protection for immigrants is an attack on the country itself. I heard Raskin also called Miller out on his history, pointing out that his claims about warrants and due process never applying in immigration law are just historically inaccurate. Legal checks have always been part of it, even if applied inconsistently. Raskin really summed up Trump's message to judges. Basically, rule my way or I'll push to impeach you. It's an ultimatum, not a legal argument. That's the threat. Rule based on ideology, not law, or face consequences. It's a huge, dangerous shift towards ideological purity tests for judges, absolutely not what the founders intended. Then you hear Trump at rallies calling judges who block him communist radical left judges. It's a classic delegitimization tactic. Slap an extreme label on opponents, avoid dealing with the substance, just dismiss them. It's dehumanizing, painting them as enemies for doing their constitutional job. And he always frames it as, they're stopping me from keeping you safe, portraying legal limits as threats to security. That's a common authoritarian playbook. Any check on power is painted as dangerous. So, when Justice Jackson issues this warning, it's not just about a few mean tweets. It's this whole ecosystem, a much broader assault on democratic institutions. The judiciary is one piece, but we see similar patterns with attacks on the press, on election integrity, attempts to purge civil servants, weaponizing agencies. It all seems interconnected, aimed at undermining checks and balances. Now, they're taking this fight over Venezuelan deportation straight to the Supreme Court, asking them to fast-track it. That's definitely a big test for the court, especially with the newer justices. Will they stand up for the rule of law against this kind of executive pressure, even in a really charged case? We'll have to see. But all of this must be doing real long-term damage to public trust, making people see courts as just political entities. Absolutely. When the judiciary is constantly framed as a political battlefield, people lose faith in its impartiality. If that legitimacy erodes, the foundation of our legal system gets shaky. And the hypocrisy, the whole law and order mantra, but then attacking the legal system itself when it gets in your way, it shows law and order seems to be a tool for them, not a principle they actually respect when it applies to their own power. It becomes very selective. Law for thee, but not for me, essentially. We should also mention the role of parts of the media. Right-wing media often acts as a huge amplifier for these attacks, repeating the rhetoric, legitimizing it, and helping erode broader trust. Globally, what does this mean for our image? America as a beacon of democracy takes a massive hit. How can the US credibly promote democratic norms abroad when things like this are happening at home? It gives ammunition to actual authoritarian regimes around the world. So, for people listening, what's the takeaway? What can anyone even do? Well, first, just being informed, paying attention. Understanding this isn't normal political noise, that the stakes are really high. Don't tune it out, and then support organizations working to protect these institutions. Demand accountability from elected officials. Ask them where they stand on judicial independence. It sounds basic, but it matters. Because going back to Justice Jackson's warning, this isn't random. It feels like a deliberate project to dismantle checks and balances. Perhaps her warning serves as a crucial reminder that democracy isn't guaranteed. It needs defending, and that defense requires vigilance, understanding what's happening. It's an ongoing responsibility for everyone who values that system. Let's just pause on that for a second. A sitting Supreme Court justice says the administration's attacks are not random, designed to intimidate and risk undermining our Constitution. Just let that reality sink in. What does it signal about where things stand? It really forces you to ask, how resilient are these institutions we take for granted when they face this kind of sustained internal pressure? What's the breaking point, and what happens after that? Definitely something to think about. Thank you for listening. Keep digging deeper, keep asking questions. I'll be back soon with another deep dive.